Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Amanda Lamb. In today's deep dive conversation, we're talking with WRAL's state government reporter Will Doran about the North Carolina Compassionate Care Act, which would make marijuana legal for medical purposes in our state. Welcome to the program, Will.
Thanks for having me.
So today we are talking right after the initial vote of the Senate before the second vote of the Senate. Will, tell me about how this went down in the Senate and what the debate was on the floor from both sides.
Sure. So people who have been following state politics know that this is now the second year in a row that the Senate has voted to legalize medical marijuana. And it really came out of left field, or actually right field maybe, because it had a Republican sponsor on it.
Interesting.
And this is something that Democrats have been pushing for years in North Carolina, and it just, was ignored. But then suddenly, one of the most powerful Republicans in the state legislature, Senator Bill Rabin, who's a veterinarian from Southport, put his name on this bill and said, hey, this is something that I think is important. And I talked to Senate Leader Phil Berger yesterday, and, it was a pretty commanding vote in favor of this. It was 36-10 in the 50-member Senate. So, you had over 3 times as many people voting for it as you did voting against it. And I asked him, what happened? How are all these, Republicans voting for, to legalize marijuana? And he said really a big part of it was Senator Rabin's personal story. He's a cancer survivor and, really kind of, was willing to, make himself a little bit vulnerable and tell his story to a lot of his colleagues and really sell it that way.
That's fascinating. So what did he say about how, I guess, marijuana, if he was able to use it during that time when he was going through treatment, what did he say it meant to him?
Yeah, he's always not quite answered that question on,
okay.
Usage, but it at least got him researching it
and thinking about what it could mean for somebody going through treatment.
Because there's so much pain and nausea associated with cancer, and that's one of the medical ailments that this bill will allow doctors to prescribe marijuana for if it does pass. This is something that really has kind of been going on behind the scenes for a few years now, but it just seemed that now was the time to actually go public with it and actually push forward. And we should note, almost every state in the country has done this already. North Carolina is one of a small number of outliers who haven't.
I think I read in some of your reporting that all but 13 states have laws about medical marijuana. And I think let's backtrack for a minute. I think it's a little confusing right now because there are states that have medical marijuana laws. There are states that allow marijuana. And then there's all these other things, CBD and hemp and Delta 8 or 9. We do not have any legalization of actual marijuana currently in North Carolina, correct?
Correct. You can go to a CBD store and pick up, products like you just mentioned, like, CBD oils or hemp, things like that. And hemp is a close cousin of marijuana. It's virtually the same plant, but the key difference is it doesn't have that psychoactive component, THC.
Right. And I think, is there some kind of rule about there's allowed to be like a trace amount, but it's right. but it can't rise to a certain level.
Right. That's kind of the differentiation between hemp and marijuana.
Now, you mentioned cancer as one of the things on the list that this could be used for. What are some of the other things?
A big one is PTSD. Actually, one of the biggest groups that has been lobbying for this down at the legislature have been veterans, and particularly younger veterans, from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Some older veterans as well, Vietnam age. But they've been saying, look, the VA system is giving us these just cocktails of a dozen pharmaceuticals for me to treat my PTSD, and it just didn't do anything for me. And my friend told me about marijuana, and so I tried it. And it really improved my symptoms. And, we heard a lot of really emotional testimony from people, talking about how they, were holding a gun against their head one night and, almost pulled the trigger, but just decided to give it one more shot and try this, one kind of what they thought was maybe a last ditch effort, of like
to relax their mind.
Right, exactly. And a lot of them said this really works. And kind of building on that, we've also seen I mean, we have two of the biggest military bases in the world here in North Carolina with Fort Bragg and Camp Lejeune. And, those are in kind of more rural areas of the state represented by Republicans. And that big outcry of support from the veterans groups in those areas has actually kind of led a lot of Republican lawmakers to get on board with this.
I mean, that's a really powerful lobby when you think about it. People who have served our country who are saying, hey, this works for me based on what I've been through.
Right. Not only this works for me, but what we're doing currently isn't working for me.
Right.
And we, it's not that
and we're supposed
to
be
want to get high.
Sure. No, we're supposed to be supporting veterans, obviously.
Exactly.
And I know there are things that aren't on the list. Also on the list, sickle cell anemia, Parkinson's, but it's really kind of a pretty small list. What are the things that have been left off that people are saying, hey, we really should include X, Y, and Z?
Yeah. And I should point out it's a purposefully small list. While we do have Republicans voting on this, there, talking to Senator Rabin, there's, kind of a realization that, okay, people don't want to go too far. And he's been very clear, like if North Carolina does pass this, he believes that we'll have the strictest laws for medical marijuana of anywhere in the country. And that's kind of been his selling point to some of the more social conservatives. So what he said is he doesn't want to have more kind of vague ailments on it, like, glaucoma, chronic pain, things like that, where people could be accused of faking it to just get a prescription from their doctor. And, that's his line that,
Sure.
And there's been some concerns that, this is just a gateway to full legalization. He wants to cut that out
But
completely.
Definitely not, because I think when you first hear about this, you think, it's for pain, but that's not specifically on that list.
Correct.
It's for specific diagnosed ailments, basically.
Correct. And that has been a concern of some activists and some particularly Democratic lawmakers. And, they point out, too, like we have a really bad issue in North Carolina with the opioid crisis.
Sure.
And, they say, if we allow this for opioid abatement treatment, basically, taking people who are already addicted to opioids and prescribing them marijuana instead.
Are we just trading one evil for another, is what people say.
Right.
I understand. Okay. Well, we'll be back after the break with more from Will Doran about what this bill means to the future legalization of marijuana in our state. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm talking with Will Doran about the legalization of marijuana for medical purposes. Now, we talked briefly in the first half of the show, Will. You said this was brought up last year. This was brought up in the last session. Tell me how it did at that time.
It actually had a very similar vote in the Senate last year as it did this year. So there were no really big surprises when it passed here now. The biggest question has always been what's going to happen in the other chamber of the legislature, in the state house. It didn't go anywhere in the House last year. But talking to some of the leaders in both the House and the Senate, it sounds like Republicans there are a little bit more on board this year. It wasn't a case where it went up for a vote in the House and failed. The leadership just wouldn't allow it for a vote at all. And it sounds like this year chances are probably better, if not good, that it'll actually go for a vote. So that's going to be, the big kind of next storyline that we're going to be following down the legislature.
Absolutely. And, when I think about this, we've mentioned veterans groups lobbying for it. There are potential stakeholders here, obviously. What about farmers? What are farmers saying? Because obviously this is something that they could participate in.
Sure. Obviously tobacco is king in North Carolina. Everyone knows that. But tobacco sales have been dropping. And
dramatically dropping.
Yeah. And so there's a thought that, hey, if there's this potential new crop out there that could be an even bigger cash crop than tobacco was, this is a way to really boost rural parts of the state and our rural economies.
Yeah, I mean, we're uniquely set up for that, given the fact that we have so many farmers in our state. How would it be distributed? Would it go through a pharmaceutical company? And what are pharmaceutical companies saying? Are they worried about competition?
It would not go through a pharmaceutical company. Because, there's obviously marijuana is still illegal at the federal level, even though, as I said earlier, basically every state has done this. The federal government still hasn't. And that creates problems for getting loans from banks and going through pharmaceutical companies and all things like that. And so what the state would do instead is we would give out licenses to companies to open up dispensaries. And there would be a pretty limited number of those dispensaries that could open throughout the state. I think it's no more than 80 stores.
And probably, I would assume, maybe a lot of people that are currently in the CBD, hemp industry might transition into something like that because they're already kind of in that loop.
A lot of them would love to. One complaint that we've heard is the way the bill is written may kind of weigh things in favor of big out-of-state companies that already have tons of experience in other states doing this. And, there's an argument for that. Say, look, we're about to start this. We don't want to just hand over the keys to untested people who don't necessarily know what they're doing. We want to bring in people who actually have experience. But because this has been illegal in North Carolina, a lot of local people don't really have experience.
Right. I understand. So you've got to ask the question when you're looking at this. I'm sure there are people who say, well, this is just the first step to legalizing marijuana in the state of North Carolina overall, and this is a gateway. We don't want to go there. I mean, what kind of talk are you hearing surrounding that theory?
That's been really the main opposition against it is that, the slippery slope argument that, okay, well, if we do this, then it's only a matter of years until we fully legalize it. And some people say, yeah, that sounds great. Let's do it. If you look at public polling, the majority of North Carolinians support full legalization of marijuana, even for recreational use. However, the majority of Republican voters don't support that. And so what you've really heard from Republican politicians is, that's the main opposition, is that we think that medical marijuana is just kind of this slippery slope to full legalization. And the Republican sponsors of this bill have said no. As I mentioned earlier, they've said we've written this to be incredibly strict. And that goes from not just the list of things that medical marijuana can be used for, but even down to, how aggressively companies are going to be allowed to market it. And,
so every aspect of it.
Yeah, they can't have neon signs, things like that. They've really put a lot of thought into kind of, trying to make it as invisible as possible.
That makes sense. So, and we talked a little bit about this, but one more vote in the Senate as of this recording should be a routine vote. And then it's on to the House, and that's where this is going to land in terms of whether it will go forward. How long will that process take, potentially?
Oh, at the legislature, it could be up for a vote next week, or it could take months or even years. Like I said earlier, we are expecting it to have more support in the House this year. There was a lot of turnover in the 2022 elections. Republicans obviously still hold a majority, but there's, a new crop of people there. And, as you change politicians, you maybe change views on things. And so it seems that there is much more momentum for it this year.
Will, thank you so much for explaining this and for your continued reporting that we will continue to follow on this very important issue. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and making us part of your morning routine. If you like what you're hearing, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or whatever podcast app you use. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email waiting in your inbox every morning with Triangle news, events, and headlines to get you ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.